Welcome back to Pacific Front Untold. Today we're beginning a three-part series on the Powell family, whose story runs through some of the most difficult questions of war, journalism, government power, and historical memory in 20th century. Our first episode focuses on JB Powell, the American journalist who operated the China Weekly Review in Shanghai. Long before the United States formally entered the Pacific War, Powell was reporting on China, foreign policy, and Japan's expanding military aggression. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, everything changed. Powell was arrested by the Japanese occupation authorities and imprisoned at Bridge House Prison in Shanghai. There, he endured interrogation, torture, and severe physical deprivation. The damage to his health was so serious that he ultimately lost both feet. But Powell survived, and after the war, he continued to speak publicly about what he had witnessed and experienced. Today, we're joined by his grandson, Thomas Powell, to talk about not just J.P. Powell, the journalist, the prisoner, but also the man his family remembered and how his experiences shaped the generations that followed. Tom, I want to begin with the family story. When you were growing up, how was your grandfather remembered? Was he primarily the journalist who ran the China Weekly Review, the man who survived Japanese imprisonment, or was he simply your grandfather?
No, he was almost mythical kind of person. He wasn't really known by the family at all because he had spent his entire life or his career in Shanghai, and that he only came back to the United States on one occasion, and so from 1917 until 1943 or 42, he was in China, and his wife, my grandmother, would go back and forth between Missouri, where she grew up in Hannibal, and Shanghai, where JB lived and where the review offices were located. And so she shuttled. She had this kind of she left my father and his older sister with her great aunt in Hannibal, and they were raised by by Nellie and Arthur Sargent, and Martha would go back and forth between Hannibal and and Shanghai, and she would come back with stories to tell the family, but they weren't personal stories so much as reports on the doings of great news events that were going on in China. And so I didn't know him. He died. JB died before I was born, and before my brothers were born. And it's not clear to me that anybody really, including Martha, really knew him very well, that he was a very private man in regard to his person. And that's comes out in his memoir. It's not a memoir of his life and his thoughts and his anxieties and the things that he's doing. It's a memoir of all these enormous political events that are going on in China during this great period of upheaval.
Yeah, and so when he went home, I mean, I know that you didn't know him too well. You were born after he passed away. Do you know if he talked about anything that he had experienced when he returned home?
Well, he put it all into his memoirs. He came home. He was crippled. He was in very poor health because he was arrested by the Japanese authorities in China and thrown into a dungeon. And he got beriberi. And then from that, he got gangrene in his feet, and he was very sick. And so the Japanese, agreed to repatriate him because he was an internationally renowned journalist. uh, and he had political friends in Washington, and they didn't want him to die on in their prison cell, so they agreed to send him home. And so he came back to landed in Brooklyn. They rushed him to the hospital, and he was there in the hospital and in a recovery center for a year, getting skin grafts and bone grafts. And his weight had dropped from 160 pounds down to 75 pounds. And so he was a sick man. And so the family didn't really come and hang out at his bedside since they were in Missouri and Washington, D.C. And so there wasn't a lot of sort of personal and familial communication in his generation of our family.
And
Mhm.
so, were there like so all of his life? Then the family only really gradually understood through like letters, publications, testimonials, and also like archival research and the memoir.
Well, nobody has really in the family done that kind of research, and I don't have the energy to do that kind of research. I'd be happy if some graduate student would take it on. And I know that's being done in China, that I've been contacted by various sources in China who want to know more about it, and I steer them to archives and sources. But in the States, he hasn't become a person of interest, academic interest yet. But I think that probably is starting to change.
Yeah, and what was first brought JB Powell to China, and how did he get involved in journalism there? That's very far from Missouri.
Well, I think that we don't know his family history, but I don't think he felt he fit in Missouri. That he was brought up in a very small town uh, in Missouri that was a few miles from the Mississippi River, Palmyra, and when he was young, he got out of that town as quick as he could and got over to Columbia to go to college. And he took courses in journalism, and journalism offered him an opportunity to see the larger world and to realize there was so much more than this, farming state with its endless fields of corn and soybeans and whatnot. And so he just fell in love with the world and the stories of the world. And so he completed his journalism degree at Missouri, and then he started finding jobs working in that field. And he helped set up a newspaper in Quincy, Illinois, and he wrote a pamphlet about that on how you do that. And that pamphlet ended up getting him a job with a journalist by the name of Thomas Millard, who was also from Missouri, who was perhaps 20 years older than JB. He was born about the time of the Civil War, 1860s. And he had, Millard had gotten out of Missouri as fast as he could, too. And I apologize to Missourians in the audience, but the truth was that Millard was anxious to get out of there, too. And he made it to New York, and he got on as a theater critic with the New York Herald. And then he became a war correspondent and started reporting war stories. And he reported the Greco-Italian War and the Spanish-American War, and I don't know, the Boxer Rebellion in China. That's when he got to China, and he realized China was an amazing place to live. And so he stayed there, and he set up a newspaper there with some Chinese investors. And then he wasn't quite happy with that and wanted his own paper. And so he wrote to the journalism school at Missouri and said, "Who have you got that can set up a newspaper for me over here in China. And they recommended JB. He was teaching, he was sort of an adjunct professor, and he was teaching, and he had written this pamphlet on how to do it. And so they recommended him, and he and Millard corresponded back and forth. And Millard said, "Come on over, I'll hire you." So he got the job, and he went over there, and he spent several months, lining up everything you needed, bringing type over to set in those days you had individual little pieces of type for each character and each letter, and just all the things you needed to office and advertising and everything, circulation stuff. And so he started this news magazine for Millard, and it was called Millard's Review of the Far East. And he helped him out and got it set up, and then it was time to go back to Missouri. So we went back to Missouri, and he was in a situation where he was either going to have to find a job writing copy for an advertisement agency or something. There wasn't a lot of opportunities, and Millard telegrammed him back and said, "Get back over here. I really need your help in running this. This is hard." And so he said, "Well, I'd love to, but I'll have to bring my wife and my daughter with me." And so that was agreed. So he took his family with him to Shanghai, and so he was there for till 1921 is when the family came back from Shanghai, because by then my father had been born, and he was a year old, and they were living in a residence hotel, and my father's older sister was, I don't know, 6 or 7, and she was running wild up and down the hallways of the hotel, and it wasn't a great situation for children. And JB had this idea that they could go back to Missouri and leave the children with relatives in Missouri, and he and Martha then could go back to Shanghai, and that's eventually what happened.
Wow. So in 1921, your father went back to Missouri. And so then JB was kind of this absentee father from China. I mean, all the way parenting from China.
Yeah, but he was in the States for a year, because as he was getting ready to leave Shanghai, the Chamber of Commerce of Shanghai, the business association there, approached him and said, "We want you to become a lobbyist for our organization. We want to send you to Washington, D.C., and we want to get a China Trade Act through. That we want special treatment, and we want tax and breaks and stuff for our products, and we want them tariffed at certain, you know, certain rates." And so he agreed to take that job on, and he was actually very good at it, because it's unheard of to get a legislation through Congress in a year. But he succeeded to do that, and he was able to parlay this bill through Congress, and he returned. He was, very much welcomed back into the community for this achievement that he had produced while he was back in the States. But at that time, he was in Washington. He was in Washington all the time, or New York, and Martha and the kids were back in Missouri. So once again, he was not there. He wasn't present. He had this life, and it just so happened he had a wife and children, but they were kind of,
Yeah.
they were auxiliary.
And so Menard's paper eventually became China Weekly Review, right?
Well, Millard sold him the paper in 23 or 24, something like that. I'm not sure exactly why Millard wanted out, but he did. and he was moving his operations to, I think he went to the Soviet Union. I'm not quite sure what he did. Uh, he eventually came back to the United States, but anyway, he sold the paper to JB, and I mean he sold the paper. Yeah, Millard sold the paper to JB, and JB didn't have any money. His family were middle class at best, and so he didn't have any money. But Martha's family had money. That her father had been the bank manager for a major bank there in Hannibal. And so she had been a debutante, and they lived in a big white house on the hill with, with sort of Jeffersonian columns in front. And and she had sort of a pampered upbringing, and she never really had a job or had to work. So somehow, I guess from the old man or from somehow they got the money they finagled it to buy the paper. But he ended up buying the paper. And I say paper, but it was actually a magazine. It was, sort of glue bound with a wraparound cover. And it had 2 columns per page. And it was kind of a 6 by 9 inch format.
And what kind of readership did it serve with China Weekly Review?
Well, it had a really diverse readership. I mean, it had a readership in the United States because there was a business community in the United States that was interested in China and China trade. And so it had, and then there was also a readership of academics and people who were professionals in the history and stuff, university professors. So it had a readership there. And then in China, it had a readership of the entire business community of Shanghai, which was quite large. And it also had a readership of the educated Chinese, which was also a very large community, because missionaries, first Catholic missionaries in the 1500s, and later English and American missionaries in the 18th century or 19th century, had set up schools and hospitals. And so they had educated a large number of Chinese who spoke English. And they'd sent them off to college in the States or in Japan or in Europe. And so there was a very large community of Chinese who had been educated at Harvard or at Cambridge or at important schools and were very fluent in English and spoke English amongst themselves and were part of the business and academic community, were very influential. So that was also another group. And then there was the missionary community as well. And the missionary community was very large in China and very spread out. And there were, the British Anglican missionaries and the American Protestant missionaries. And they all set up schools and hospitals and eventually universities. So that was, the readership. It was diverse and, it was educated. And the review was written for an educated audience. You needed to be fairly fluent. I mean, the vocabulary was not, reduced to, to 4th or 5th grade reading level, like so many papers. It was a, a thoughtful, intellectual news magazine, and
And,
sort of.
and yeah, and at the time, were there any other English language newspapers or
Yeah,
magazines
there were quite a
operating?
few. There was competition, the China Daily News, and this was a weekly, but there were daily papers. The British had a couple of papers there. The Russians had a newspaper. The French had a newspaper. All the colonial powers had their own newspapers, and they were run privately by and subsidized to some extent by their governments in various ways.
And how independent was China Weekly Review then? Like, was since Powell didn't take, subsidy from government, was he more willing to criticize any authorities like American, European, Chinese, and Japanese authorities at the time?
He was quite outspoken, but he was not a radical leftist. Okay, he was a businessman. He was a capitalist. He believed that the nationalist government was on the right track, that China needed to modernize, that it needed to come into the 20th century, that it needed to mechanize its agriculture with machinery. And he supported the government of Sun Yat-sen and then Chiang Kai-shek when after Sun died, when Chiang Kai-shek became the head of the Kuomintang. And so he supported him. So he didn't challenge the government, the Chinese government, to the extent that he would snip at the British or at the French, or complain about their actions, or complain about missionary behavior or things like that. He was critical of pretty much everybody around him, but he was critical in a way that was constructive. That he didn't, he didn't, say malicious or things to gain subscribers or anything, or didn't engage in any kind of yellow journalism. He was quite even-handed in his criticism, and it wasn't he was, I don't know, he was respected, pretty much by everybody.
Yeah, I found some photo of him with Chiang Kai-shek, but then the interesting thing is that he also allowed Edgar Snow to write on China Weekly Review, even though that Edgar Snow was interviewing Mao, so not quite the leader that JB was kind of cheering for. So he actually allowed like opposition voices in a way.
Yes, Edgar Snow was also from Missouri,
Yes.
and he was I don't think he graduated from the school there, but he had taken some classes there, and he had a letter of recommendation when he showed up at the review offices. But he was quite a bit younger than JB. Edgar Snow was born in the 20th century. JB is from the 1880s. And so he was a radical and a firebrand, but he also was willing to tromp around the countryside. He was an adventurer. He'd sleep on the ground. He was willing to experience hardship to get the story. And at this time, there had been a war going on between the internal war, civil war going on in China since 1931. And so and Mao was somebody that nobody knew about. He was this leader of the Chinese Communist Party that the Western world knew nothing about. And so it was a real scoop when Edgar Snow got this interview with Mao. And so, of course, it was something that JB was willing to print, and then also it was very informative because the Kuomintang didn't know much about Mao either, and so they were interested in reading it. So it wasn't like it was something to be censored; it was something to be educated by the various parties there, and I think that's how it was seen.
Yeah, definitely. And what did Shanghai offer an American journalist during this period that, Edgar Snow and JB Powell might not have found elsewhere.
Well, China was just in a complete sort of state of political chaos, for since the Boxer Rebellion. It had been uh, just one uprising and one faction fighting, and just for the all the way until the end of World War II. There was nothing but armies marching across the country and huge massacres of peasants, where 10,000 villagers in this little town or someplace would be killed for some infraction done by somebody else. And it was appalling, the lawlessness that was happening. And that was news. And Shanghai was the center. I mean, it was the commercial center of China. It was a city that grew from nothing, from some mud huts into this megalopolis of 3 million people by 1935 or 40. It was huge. And there were all these factories. And then it was a wide open, Wild West kind of town too. Capitalism on steroids. People came there from anywhere because you could make a fortune there. That's what it was believed. That was the sort of the explanation, that you could make your fortune there if you were ambitious and you were unscrupulous. You could get cheap labor and manufacture stuff and ship it somewhere and sell it, and whatever. And so there was a huge criminal element there. There was all these entrepreneurs and get rich quick. There was a Jewish community that had some incredibly wealthy people, like the Sassoon family. And it was also the city with the most skyscrapers and tall buildings in all of Asia. That it was behind Chicago and New York as a skyscraper capital of the world. And so there was so much action there. Things
Yeah.
happened there. And that's what intrigued people, that they all wanted to go and see. The Westerners did, because it just was a wild, wide open town.
And what kinds of political and military and social developments did the journal cover during the years before Pacific War?
Pretty much anything and everything, that they covered. Reporting was, very local. And even I mean, they covered a lot of international news, more so than any other journal in China. They covered, things going on in Indonesia, uprisings and rebellions against the Dutch. They covered things happening in Africa and American news, stuff happening in the United States. And so there was a big international component to the paper. But it was also very much a lot of small stories of things happening locally, about what was going on at, a meeting of some cabal of people involved in this. And uh, like Time magazine has all these little short articles that
Yeah.
are, well, they took that style from the Review, because that was something that JB and Millard had kind of perfected, is the short news blurb where you, one or two paragraphs, and you tell a story. And so you could have a page and it could have 4 stories or 5 stories even on it, that are just short little news clips. But it allows you to get a lot of news in. You're getting the headlines mostly, not a lot of the detail, but you're getting the big picture. And then they had feature articles too, like the interview with Snow's interview with Mao, where it would go on for 2, 3, 4 pages, a couple of
Yeah.
thousand words.
And so did Powell's reporting on Japanese aggression make him a particular target before United States entered the war? Like I know that he probably interviewed Chiang Kai-shek quite few times, and he was really strong on like reporting on like Japanese aggression in China. So did that make him like a particular target?
Yes, it did. The Japanese were very aggressive and uh, invaded China in 1931 behind the Mukden incident. They staged a phony railroad bombing and then used that to justify a major invasion force to come in and occupy and restore order. Uh, and then in 1937, they launched a major offensive, sent over 500,000 soldiers or something to take much of the coast of China and capture, Shanghai and Canton and other cities along the coast at that time, and controlled it. And so there was atrocities. The Japanese were exceedingly brutal in their form of imperialism. That they trained going back for several generations to at least to the beginning of the shogunate in very abusive and punitive subjugation of their own citizenry, and then they did the same wherever they went. They were exceedingly brutal, and they massacred people and forced people to taxation and whatnot. And they were loathed throughout the Asia as they expanded. None of the countries they entered into to have any, warm feelings towards the Japanese, even to this day with their denialism. And so that's what JB wrote about, was just their brutality and how unbelievable it was and how instances could be manufactured, that the Japanese were very good at this. They'd manufacture some phony incident so that they could come in and rush in with their military and seize control
Yeah.
and, execute many people in the process and leave bodies strewn around.
And
So
uh-huh.
So he exposed that. He'd go off and look at it, or he'd send somebody to go check it out for him and write it up, and he'd have a headline and a story about that, and they were very unbecoming stories.
Yeah.
I mean,
And so what was the atmosphere in Shanghai like in the months leading to Pearl Harbor?
it was very frightening. They from the late 30s, it was a very tense situation in Shanghai, and the Westerners lived like aristocrats in China. That was one of the things that whites had special privileges and were treated well. And they had these two areas of town, the French Quarter and the international zone, which had been the British zone but became larger when they expanded north of Suchow Creek and incorporated an area, became the international zone. And they lived like royalty. Even people of modest means lived very well in China and had servants. And my grandmother was right at home there because she didn't have to do anything. She just sat around and organized a social calendar and had a few tasks, but she essentially could, act like she was a grande dame and be waited upon by servants. And that was pretty much the entire foreign community had that kind of setup. And so they didn't think that the Japanese, well, most of them got out. And JB sent Martha and sent Bill home, before, and so those who could get out easily got out, and those who weren't didn't have some really good reason to stay left. But JB and a handful of others decided they stay and bear witness and see what happened. And they really did not believe that the Japanese would treat whites the same way they treated the Chinese. I mean, they saw how the Japanese treated the Chinese and how brutal they were, but they couldn't imagine that they would treat whites that way. And it's a reflection of the times, that level of racism, because I doubt JB would consider himself a racist, nor would most other people. But Japanese were Japs,
Hmm.
okay? And in his writing, in his book, they're Japs, okay? And the white people were privileged, period.
Hmm.
If you were white skinned, you had privileges. And that was the nature of the world at that time. And
Yeah,
that
and
was
so he
every colony.
and is that why he remained in Shanghai when, there were danger to American journalists, because he thought that the Japanese wouldn't be so brutal to him?
Exactly. He and everybody else who stayed couldn't believe that the Japanese would treat them the same as they treated the Chinese, because white racism existed in every colony where Europe went, and that was instilled that whites are superior. Um, and so, of course, they didn't believe that. It was foreign to their ideology, to their,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, and I saw this article about how heads fall, grenades explode as terrorists attack newspapers. So he knew he was in danger, but he still chose to stay because he didn't believe that. Basically, he was basically living in disbelief that Japanese would not do that to him. And like even like months before, in October 23rd at 7 p.m., he was actually attacked by a live grenade that was wrapped in the newspaper. I mean, if that was me, I wouldn't have stayed. Um
no. But Jenny, you have to remember that what was his alternative? Was it to go back to Missouri? Huh?
yeah,
That was
that's
where he
true.
had left. That would be the last place that he would want to return to. And so he was willing to stick it out.
Wild.
I mean, that life back in Missouri would have been another death knell for him in a
Yeah.
different way. So,
And so what happened to the China Weekly Review immediately after Pearl Harbor?
well, the day after Pearl Harbor is when the Japanese, it was December 8th of 1941, the Japanese invaded Shanghai and took over the British colony and the French colony there that they marched in and took over. And so they announced initially that they were going to round people up. There'd be no prosecutions or anything. So there was this sort of sense of relief on the parts of the foreigners. And then they started sending around vans, Black Marias at night and kidnapping people. And so that was the way that the Japanese secret police worked, the Kuomintang, was that they'd make a statement to try to alleviate fears, and then they'd go around at night and do exactly the opposite, kidnap people. And so that's what happened to JB after a couple of nights. They came and grabbed him out of his hotel room where he was living, and threw him in a van and took him to Bridge House, which was the had been a hotel, which the secret police took over and turned into their headquarters in prison. And he was thrown in a cell that was a small cell, it was 12 by 16, with 40 prisoners.
And do you think
And
he was arrested because he was an American citizen, because of his journalism, or because like Kempe Tai thought that viewed him as politically dangerous?
well, when you say arrest, you imply some sort of formality, that there is a charge, that there is some sort of judge you'll come in front of, that there'll be some sort of official thing. They didn't operate that way. They just kidnapped people, and there was no judicial process.
Yeah.
So, but that happened to him. This cell was so small that you couldn't lie down in it. That people had to stand or squat. Uh, and he was in that cell for 3 or 4 months until he got really sick. And that's when they took him out of that cell and they moved him over to a different prison where the conditions were a little better, but where he still suffered beatings and forced to sit in on his heels, kind of Japanese style, and lost circulation to his feet, and that brought on the gangrene.
And what do you think the Japanese authorities were trying to learn from him?
They really didn't interrogate him. I mean, he doesn't mention really being interrogated. They didn't really care. I mean, everything he had to say was written in his papers. They just wanted to punish him. There
Mm.
wasn't any information they were going to garnish from him. He didn't have any secrets. He
So
wasn't.
was he accused of anything like espionage,
No, you
anti-Japanese
didn't need to be
activity?
accused. That's not how fascist regimes work. You don't need any kind of legal process. You just round people up and put them in prison.
Wow. So what kind I mean, you talked about the physical abuse that he endured, and do you know, like, if he had endured any kind of psychological abuse as well?
Well, yeah, I think that stuck in that situation is psychological abuse because people were dying in their cell. That there
Yeah.
were people who had been beaten, who were thrown in their cell that were completely bloodied and were barely breathing, and they'd die within a day or two. And you'd have to live with that, being in a cell that's dark, or there's no windows, where uh, where you have people who are sick, where there's men and women in the same cell, and there's one pot in the corner where people are to defecate and urinate, and there's no privacy, and you
Mhm.
if you have a space against the wall, you're fortunate because you can lean back against it and hug your knees. But otherwise,
Yeah.
you're being tortured by being in the cell, and the mental, you know, fatigue, and the how that's going to mess with your mind is intense.
And I saw that he basically lost 45 pounds, right? I mean, since his in that kind of situation.
Mhm.
And how long was he held there?
Well, he was in Bridge House prison for about 4 months, I think, before they moved him to this other prison. And in that time, he had gotten very sick. He had contracted beriberi, and which is horrible, kind of wasting disease. And then he had gotten gangrene. Uh, so, I mean, that's physical torture, just being cooped up. And they would come into the cells with paddles and beat the hell out of people. And you know, and they would do collective punishment as well. If somebody did something they weren't supposed to, everybody would be punished. And that's psychological torture right there.
Yeah.
And so the Japanese spent a lot of energy dreaming this stuff up. how to break people down, how to really to humiliate them and demean them, and to make them, to turn them into subhumans.
Yeah. And so, was he able to communicate with his family at all while imprisoned by the Japanese?
No, that it was a black hole there. There was nothing got out, nothing came in. It There was no communication. There was no word on his condition or anything. I think it might have seeped out when he was taken to a hospital to have his feet looked at one point before they moved him. The doctors or somebody may have, uh, leaked that what was happening with him, and there was a lot of pressure uh, put on the U.S. government to work behind the scenes to get him released, because he did have friends. He had journalist friends and owners of other newspapers that lobbied on his behalf, and he had a U.S. senator writing letters to the president and to the State Department on his behalf, and so he had people, lobbying, and so there was pressure, international pressure, put on the Japanese government to release him.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of how it came to be that he was finally repatriated. Was twofold: international pressure and his illness.
And did he later like identify any particular guards or Japanese agencies
No,
involved in his treatment? No, he just,
no, no, who knew who they were?
yeah,
They were just Kempeitai uh, thugs,
yeah,
and I mean, you could collectively know who they were, perhaps, but individually, that would be difficult
yeah.
to kind of.
So, what kind of testimony did JB Powell give after the war?
Well, his testimony was quite brief, actually, and it wasn't right away. The war crimes trial started about a year uh, after the war ended, and it took a long time to prepare and stuff. And meanwhile, JB had been repatriated in 42, and he started working on his memoirs as soon as he was physically able to. And so he was in a recovery hospital in bed, and he'd go back through issues of the review and sort of have him jog his memory, and then he would write about the stories, not about himself, unless he had gone to actually report the story, but about these historical periods in China and how the review kind of approached the story and told the story. The journalism is storytelling, and he was a very good storyteller. He had that sort of Missouri way of presenting stories. The Mark Twain. He It was very droll. It was very understated, and the punchline was always at the end. There was some sort of little twist in which they could, sort of make an announcement that, or conclude the story on a note of humor or something like that, or some sort of.
Yeah. And so, after such severe treatment by the Japanese, why did he choose to like speak publicly about it? I mean, I've seen newspaper articles where he's saying that America must win against Japanese rather than like just withdrawing from this kind of political life and journalism.
To tell you the truth, I think that he was a student of Gandhi's. Uh, he was a pacifist, though he was a war reporter. He really wanted peace, and he understood that you can condemn what someone does, but you don't condemn them as a person, that you separate the act, the deed, the heinous crime from the individual. And that's something that Martin Luther King also learned, and very much part of his philosophy is that you call out evil and the things that are done, which are evil, without condemning the people, in hopes that there is some redemption for their souls, that you can bring them around, that you can win them back. And I think that that's kind of his attitude that I see when he testified, that he, would say that the Japanese are amazing people, that they have these tremendous capabilities, and we need to welcome them into the fold of humanity and to moral and ethical sort of argument. And I kind of think that was, since I never met him, I kind of have to hope too that that was his point of view.
Yeah, and also, like, do you think he felt that justice had been achieved?
Well, I think he was relieved that the war was over. I think that, because it was very complicated, because, yes, the Japanese had been defeated, but they had been defeated at the expense of this horrific new weapon, this atomic bomb. I mean, that was really, brought on a whole new crisis. And so the Second World War was over, but the bomb initiated the whole next phase of fighting and of controversy and of conflict in the world. It was inevitable. And so I think he was kind of
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody at that time really had a firm grasp. I mean, they didn't have a crystal ball. They didn't understand that, that this was the beginning of the Cold War and this huge, you know, uh,
yeah,
struggle with the Soviet Union for global hegemony.
yeah. And so, how do you think JB Powell's experience shaped his son's Bill Powell, uh, other people would know Bill Powell as John William Powell, right?
Mhm. I think that Bill, my dad, showed up in Shanghai unannounced. That JB had just said goodbye to Martha, and Martha had left on a steamer to head back to the United States. And they ships passed, it seems, in the night, because Bill arrived right after she left.
Yeah,
And so all of a sudden he had his, instead of a wife there that he had to look after and take care of, he had his son there that he had to deal with. He had to figure out what was it, because at this point Bill was 19 or 20 years old, and he wasn't going to go home. The old man couldn't convince him to get on a boat and go home before he had explored and had adventures of his own. And so he found him a job, and he found him a job working for another newspaper, and that kept him close by. And I think JB also realized that he didn't know his son, that he had this son who was a 7-year-old boy the last time he'd seen him, and all of a sudden he's a grown man, and he's articulate, and he's very knowledgeable, and he's read the review every week, and he knows what's going on in China, and he's a journalist, and he has to deal with him as a individual, as somebody who's a intellect that is comparable to his own, and his flesh and blood. And so I think that there was this period of a year while they got to know each other and got to hang out together. and they didn't live together. Heavens, no, they lived separately. And I don't think Bill would have wanted to live with the old man. That would have been a snooze. He wanted to go out and get to know the nightlife and travel around the countryside a bit. And so, but they had a chance to get to know each other and to finally sort of uh, become father son.
And do you see a direct line between JB Powell's journalism in Shanghai and also Bill Powell's later willingness to challenge the United States government's narrative?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, JB was considered somewhat of a rebel and as a voice of reason and rational and he was also quite pragmatic. And I think that he was willing to stand up to power. He was willing to tell it as it was, and I think that rubbed off. And but I kind of think Bill was quite a bit more obstinate than the old man, and that might have been his from his mother's side.
Yeah, and next week we'll explore more about Bill Powell, but you had some comments. Someone said, wasn't Shanghai the most culturally diverse in the world 100 years ago? I would agree. So I would agree.
I would
Um,
say yes, that's probably true. That was an international city. There were people from all over the world that lived there. There were many Jews that came to Shanghai right during the war and before the war because it was one of the only open, in fact, it was the only open port in the world that allowed immigration of Jewish refugees. And so there was a large community of Jews that began in the late 30s into the 40s that showed up there. There were Russians, white Russians that had were fleeing the Russian Revolution that had made their way down to Harbin and then to Shanghai. So there was a large Russian community there. There were the original concessions of the British and the French. There were Dutch there because the Dutch also had concessions. And then, of course, there were Japanese, and there were Filipinos. There were a lot of other Asians in China as well, Vietnamese. And so, yes, your writer is right that it was the most international city at that time.
and he also said that his mom's family were in the Chape internment camp in Shanghai, and his great grandfather owned nearly a half of the properties in Shanghai before the war. So yeah,
Well, he may have been related to the Wassoons or to one of the other families. The Wassoons were Jews from Iraq,
yeah,
and they had made a lot of money initially in India, and then had spread out. And
yeah,
so, yeah, that's
yeah,
very interesting.
yeah. This is great. Thank Jenny and Thomas. Well, thank you so much, guys, for watching. And if you've made it this far, please subscribe. It's free for you to do so. And we'll see you next week, right, Thomas? We'll
Yeah, we
talk about
will. Thank you very much, Jenny.
your father's challenges to the United States. I mean, the his he was the first one to talk about Unit 731 in in the United States, and we'll talk about his journey next week.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.